Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday webinar series. We are glad to have you here today. My name is Lourdes. I'm a patient advocate with the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. We have today Dr. Mitesh Borad and Dr. Thomas Schuetz. Dr. Thomas Schuetz is the co-founder of Compass Therapeutics. He has over 25 years of experience in medical oncology and biopharmaceutical drug development. Thomas did his medical training at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he served as the chief medical resident, and he completed a medical oncology fellowship at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. Dr. Mitesh Borad is a professor of medicine, program leader for the Gene and Virus Therapy Program, and director of the Precision Cancer Therapeutics Program at Mayo Clinic Comprehensive Cancer Center in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Borad received his MD from Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, completed internal medicine training at Cedars-Sinai, and medical oncology training at Tulane University. Thank you both for being here today. Before we get started, I just want to remind our audience to please enter any questions into the Q&A and to please keep your questions general in nature, as our presenters cannot answer specific questions.
Okay. Thanks, Lourdes. I really appreciate the time today, and really happy to be talking to all of you again. I've talked to a couple of you before, and I really have enjoyed talking to you in these webinars. Just a reminder, a very important reminder, I'm going to be talking about a drug today that we call CTX-009, which is an investigational drug. So that means this drug is not yet approved by the FDA, and it is currently undergoing testing in patients in the US in clinical trials. And I'm going to be talking about a couple of those clinical trials today. So we're doing some studies based on some data that we've seen with this drug in prior studies that I'm going to summarize today. And we're doing a clinical trial with this drug in patients with cholangiocarcinoma. So just very briefly, thinking about cancer therapies, and I know that many of you all know all of the categories of drugs on this slide, but I just wanted to mention a couple. Chemotherapy, of course. These are generally chemicals that work to kill the cancer cell. Biologics are a very different kind of drug. They're made in living cells, and those are commonly antibodies. So an example of that is Avastin. Some of you, perhaps, as part of your therapy, have maybe also received a biologic called Imfinzi. Imfinzi is a subtype of biologics that is designed to stimulate your immune system, to help your immune system recognize your cancer. And then many of you also, I'm sure, are familiar with targeted therapies. And these are therapies that are specifically designed, to treat very specific types of tumors that have specific mutations. So CTX-009 is a biologics therapy. So let's talk about that drug. So 009 is something called a bispecific antibody. And there's a little cartoon of 009 over here on the right. So as many of you have probably gotten vaccines recently, many of you have gotten the COVID vaccine. The vaccine induces antibodies in your immune system that recognize the virus and then protect you from the virus. So 009 is an antibody, very similar in structure, and the antibody recognizes two different targets. And that means that it's called a bispecific antibody. So it recognizes one target called VEGF-A on the top. VEGF stands for vascular endothelial cell growth factor. That's something that stimulates the growth of blood vessels in the tumor. DLL4 on the other end of our drug binds to a target called delta-like ligand 4, which also works to stimulate blood vessel growth inside of a tumor. So how might this drug work? So one of the very important things in tumors is that they have evolved mechanisms to create their own blood supply. And the tumor then gets nutrients from the blood supply. And now there's a whole set of drugs that inhibit the ability of the tumor to make blood vessels. And CTX-009 is in that class of drugs. And the idea here is that by blocking the ability of these tumor cells to make blood vessels, we're starving the tumor of nutrients, and then ultimately the tumor would die of starvation. And that's the goal of this therapy. So we've begun the testing of this drug in patients. Of course, as you know, drugs go through a whole series of testing in animals ahead of time. All of that has been completed, and we've now begun to treat patients. So this drug began its life at a small biotech company in South Korea. Compass acquired that company, and Compass, we're based in Boston. And so we're a fully US-based company. So we're now doing the clinical trials in the United States. So in the phase 1 study, which was the first time this drug was ever given to patients, we saw something quite unexpected, which is that patients with colon cancer and stomach cancer had their tumors shrink in size, something called a response. So we had responses to this drug in patients with tumors that arise from the gastrointestinal tract. That's not unexpected because DLL4 is involved in the development of your GI tract. Now, drugs that target blood vessels generally work better with chemotherapy. So we did a very small study called a phase 1b study, where we combined 009 with chemotherapy. And we had 4 patients in that study with cholangiocarcinoma. This was a study that enrolled anybody, so it was not a disease-specific study. And much to our surprise, we had several patients with cholangiocarcinoma whose tumors decreased substantially. So on the next slide, this is something called a waterfall plot, which I've shown to you all before, where each bar is an individual patient that was enrolled in the study. So again, we have to be fair about this. This was a small study, only 17 patients. But in the orange color here are patients with cholangiocarcinoma. And we had 2 patients who had received previous chemotherapy who had quite substantial reductions in their tumor size, 40 to 60%. And these reductions were quite long-lived in these patients. These patients enjoyed a decline in their tumor burden that lasted almost a year. And I know many of you have seen your own CT scans, and I thought it might be important just to take a look at one of these patients' CT scans. This is a patient with cholangiocarcinoma. So you can see in the liver here with the red arrow, a large tumor in the liver. Unfortunately, this patient had cholangiocarcinoma that had spread outside of the liver, over here on the bottom in the lungs, and over here underneath the skin with the red arrow. So moving left to right in time, you can see the tumor decreasing in the liver quite substantially. The skin tumor actually completely disappeared, and the lung tumor almost completely disappeared. And this patient was on the study for more than a year with the tumor continuing to decline. So it was a really interesting observation for us. And it's this observation that informed the design of a phase 2 study that I'll come to in 1 minute. So one of the things that's always very important is talking about potential side effects of these drugs. So this is a full table of the side effects that we saw in our phase 1 program. So in both studies, the most common side effect that we saw was high blood pressure. So high blood pressure is a very common side effect that you see with drugs in this class of drugs. So drugs like Avastin, for example. There's a new drug called fruquintinib. And many of these drugs, we see blood pressure going up in patients. And you'll be very closely monitored if you receive this drug. And if your blood pressure goes up, we have treatments that we can give for that. There's a whole set of side effects related to chemotherapy, which I know many of you know full well, blood counts going down, etc. So when we saw in our phase 1 program that patients with cholangiocarcinoma seemed to benefit from this drug, we decided to do a phase 2 study. So this is a phase 2 study that was different in that this only enrolled patients with biliary tract cancers. So cholangiocarcinoma, gallbladder cancer, etc. And here's the treatment regimen the patients received. 009, which is given as an intravenous infusion every other week based on your body weight, and the chemotherapy drug paclitaxel, which is also known as Taxol. Interestingly, the patients in our phase 1b study who had their tumors decline received 009 in combination with paclitaxel. So here's a diagram of the study design where we decided that we wanted to see if we could reproduce what we saw in the phase 1 study. So we were planned to treat 21 patients. If we saw 3 or more patients with tumor declines, we would treat 45 more patients. So I'm going to come back to that decision in 1 minute. So here are the patients that were enrolled in the study. 24 patients total were enrolled. You can see typical age, 61 or so years old on average, men, women. And it was a mix of patients who had received either 1 or 2 previous chemotherapy regimens. So many of you might be receiving gemcitabine and cisplatin, with or without a drug like Imfinzi. That's a very common treatment regimen. Several of these patients received that regimen. And we had a mix of patients with cholangiocarcinoma, as I mentioned, gallbladder cancer, and ampullary cancer, which is slightly different from cholangiocarcinoma. So the main result of this study, which we presented at a scientific meeting last year, is shown on this slide. So this is, again, a waterfall plot where each bar represents an individual patient. And much to our surprise, there were a large number of patients who had tumor declines. So in this study, 9 of the 24 patients, 37.5%, had tumor declines that went below 30%, which is a cutoff to define something called a partial response. So we had 37.5% of the patients had a partial response, which is quite unusual to see. Again, we have to be fair about this. This is a small study, but it's quite unusual to see this. And we had responses color-coded in each of the anatomic subtypes of biliary tract cancer. And one other thing I'll point out is that every patient that we treated in this study had some decline in the size of their tumor, which is also a little uncommon to see. So we were quite excited about this, and this result led us to design our current study. And one of the things that we did is we shared this data with the FDA here in the US, and the FDA suggested to us, I'm going back 2 slides, that we didn't need to do stage 2 of this study. And the FDA felt like for a phase 2 study, the result that I'm showing you on this slide suggested that this drug should go into a randomized trial. So that was a very good thing for us to hear from the FDA, and we took their advice, and Mitesh helped us design the study that I'll talk about in 1 minute. But let's talk about some of the other data that came out of this study. When we looked at whether or not patients had received either 1 or 2 previous chemotherapies, we found that most of the patients in the study whose tumor declined had received only 1 prior chemotherapy. So that's very interesting. That's commonly seen in patients with cancer, that unfortunately, the more chemotherapy that a patient receives with subsequent chemotherapy, unfortunately, the patients don't do as well as patients who've received less chemotherapy. You know, we also had some other interesting results from this study. On average, you know, patients in this study lived more than a year, which for patients who previously received chemotherapy, you know, that's a really good number to see. You know, certainly it is our goal, ultimately, you know, to treat patients earlier and extend patients' lives for even longer periods of time. So here are the curves. These are called Kaplan-Meier curves that just show the patients whose tumors ultimately got a little worse. Over here on the right, the patients and how long those patients live. So, you know, again, for this patient population, a very interesting result. Again, very important to talk about side effects. So we saw the side effects of chemotherapy, and then hypertension again, high blood pressure, the most common side effect that we saw from the drug 009. So in summary, this is the result of our entire phase 2 program. So we had a really nice response rate, 64% in patients treated who had received only 1 prior chemotherapy regimen, a really nice progression-free survival. That is, you know, patients' tumors did not get worse, you know, for quite some time. And as I'm sure many of you know, in the so-called second-line setting, that is, patients who've received 1 chemotherapy regimen, there's a 3-drug combination called FOLFOX. And FOLFOX has only a 5% response rate. So we felt like this was a very, very good signal, and it gave us confidence to design the study that we're now doing. So here's the study that we're doing. It's called COMPANION-002. Companion stands for Compass Angiogenesis Inhibition. Here's the clinicaltrials.gov number, where you can find information online in terms of where the study is ongoing. So this is a summary of the design of the study. And, you know, I don't see patients anymore, but when I was seeing patients, you know, I certainly knew how hard it was, you know, for patients to enter a randomized trial, because it seems, you know, sort of unfair, but it's really the only way to ultimately get the drug approved. So we're doing a study of 009 plus Taxol versus Taxol alone. So the randomization is 2 to 1. That means there's a 2/3 chance that a patient will get 009 plus Taxol and a 1/3 chance that the patient will get Taxol. But one of the things that we thought was fair, and Mitesh actually helped us quite a bit with this, if a patient is randomized to the Taxol arm and their tumor gets a little bit worse, they're allowed after 2 months on drug, 8 weeks, to cross over and get Taxol plus 009. So this is called a crossover design. And I think that's very important from the point of view of being able to get patients who volunteer for this study to have access to this drug. So this was a very important component of the study that Mitesh helped us with. So the study is up and running now. We're enrolling patients in the United States. We currently have about 30 sites open at various geographic distributions here around the country, East Coast, West Coast, Florida, Texas. Dr. Borad, of course, is at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. Some Midwestern sites here as well, a site in Denver and one site in the Pacific Northwest. And all of this is available on the clinicaltrials.gov website. So that's where we are today. Lots of patients have come into the study so far, and we're super happy about that. But we've got lots more patients that we need to enroll into the study. And maybe I'll pause there, and I'll have Dr. Borad maybe make a few comments. Dr. Borad is a member of the steering committee for the study. So the steering committee is a group of physicians who help us design the study and monitor the study as it goes on. And Dr. Borad is one of the lead members of the steering committee, and he's been instrumental in helping us design the study. So maybe I'll pause there and maybe ask Dr. Borad to maybe make a few comments.
Yeah, sure, Tom. Thanks for highlighting this study. As was pointed out, this is a promising agent that's bispecific that hits two targets that could be important in blood vessel development in cancers. And given the promising results in the study from Korea, with the caveat that this is a small group of patients where we did see interesting results, a larger study is underway, as Dr. Schuetz pointed out, across many centers in the US. So again, the first study was in Korea, and we obviously want to see what kind of results we get here, and we want to see what the contribution of the new drug is. And that's why there's a randomization with paclitaxel in one arm and both drugs in the other arm. And one of the very important factors, as Dr. Schuetz mentioned, was that members of the steering committee did not feel it would be fair to patients to receive just a single agent with no opportunity to get the investigational drug if they were randomized to the control arm. So we applaud them for being very patient-centric in their approach and putting this as part of the design in the trial. So yeah, we of course would need to complete the study to really know where things stand, but I'm very glad that new agents are coming into the clinic and offer patients the opportunity to use these as tools.
Thanks, Dr. Borad. Lourdes, I think perhaps we should go to some of the questions. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's perfect. We have a few questions, and if anyone else has any questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A or the chat. There was a question about, are there various stages of cholangiocarcinoma? And I think
so we've got two questions to start with, which are quite related. So the first, are there various stages of cholangiocarcinoma? And then a related question is, are all patients in stage 4 when they enter the study trials? So in the current study that we're doing, you don't have to be stage 4 in order to be part of the study. So in cholangiocarcinoma, so yes, there are various stages of cholangiocarcinoma, which are related to how far the tumor has spread both inside the liver and outside the liver. So those are the basic parts of the stages to that.
Okay. When referring to patients doing better in this study who have received only one previous chemotherapy regimen, are you exclusively referring to IV chemotherapy, or are you including PO chemotherapy as well?
Sure, that's a fantastic question. So I am, in fact, in the study that we did, referring specifically to IV chemotherapy. So these are patients who received chemotherapy, again, most likely gemcitabine and cisplatin.
Was there any stratifications across mutations? Do any mutations, fusions, GAs fare better than others?
Sure, this is a very, very complicated question. So as I'm sure many of you know, some patients have tumors that have mutations that can be treated with specific drugs. So there are now drugs for mutations caused by a gene called FGFR. So drugs like Pemazyre, which maybe some of you have taken. And there are also some other drugs for patients with cholangiocarcinoma. So we have not done a study where we treated people after they have received those drugs. And the FDA specifically asked us that if a patient has one of those mutations that could be treated, that the FDA suggested to us that those patients should really receive those drugs. So we're currently not treating patients. Over in the chat, some other questions appeared. Lourdes, should I just go through some of those?
Yeah, you can.
Okay?
Absolutely. That's perfect.
So when will the trial be complete? It's always hard to project these things, but we think it could be completed, sort of toward the end of this year, potentially. But it's very, very hard to project. The next question, am I able to directionally share results from the study? So the answer to that is definitely no. So at the company, I am not, I don't see any of the results from the company, from the study. So that's important because we don't want to introduce any kinds of bias to the study. So it's important for me that I don't know the results of the study while it's going on. The next one is what restrictions are on patients joining the study, previous treatments, et cetera. So the main characteristic of patients coming into the study is that patients need to have had one prior treatment regimen for their disease. So that's the main characteristic of the patients. So we've
Can
got.
I just ask,
Sure, you got
Dr.
sure.
Schuetz, when you say one prior treatment of the disease, are you referencing chemotherapy? If somebody comes and does radiation or anything like that, that's not necessarily what you're talking about, correct?
Radiation is okay,
Okay.
but yes, I'm talking specifically about chemotherapy. So now we've got 2 or 3 questions which are very similar, which are very difficult to answer. So why is Taxol used versus Abraxane? Why is paclitaxel chosen? Why does paclitaxel need to be included as the chemotherapy? So all of that is based on our observations from our prior studies, that the patients with cholangiocarcinoma did better when they got our drug combined with Taxol, paclitaxel, than they did when they received 009 with a chemotherapy drug called irinotecan. So we treated some patients with cholangiocarcinoma with 009 plus irinotecan, and we didn't see anything. So that's why paclitaxel was chosen for this study. Ultimately, what we really want to do is test this drug in combination with the first-line therapy, so gemcitabine and cisplatin. And depending on what this study shows, we would really like to combine this drug, with gemcitabine and cisplatin, and that's what we would ultimately like to do. There's another question about TKIs here. Were any patients on TKIs prior to the study? So the answer to that is no. We have not treated anyone who has received a TKI before. That's definitely something that we need to do moving forward. That's a super, super important question. Okay. What are the restrictions to participate, previous treatment, blood chemistry limitations? There are a couple of, I would describe as somewhat standard limitations. So mostly patients need to have adequate liver function and adequate kidney function. Those are the main descriptions. Can patients with immune disorders participate in the study? Another very complicated question. So it depends is the answer, and this is a specific question that I can't really give a specific yes no to. It depends on what the immune disorder might be. Okay. Just to make sure, is more than one line of chemotherapy an exclusion? Unfortunately, yes. I'm sorry. For this study, if you have more than one line of chemotherapy, that is an exclusion. What are TKIs? TKI stands for tyrosine kinase inhibitor. It's a specific type of drug that targets a specific type of component of the tumor. So Pemazyre, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is a TKI. My husband was diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma, received Gemcis, Folfox, expression. So, this is a very similar question to the question about one line of chemotherapy. Gemzar and cisplatin would count as one, and Folfox would count as two. So I'm sorry, that patient would not be eligible. There's a specific question about Abraxane. Can a patient come in the study if they've previously had Abraxane? The answer to that is yes. Can someone cross over to prior to 8 weeks if a scan showed progression? The first scheduled scan is at 8 weeks, but if a scan happened to show progression, I think the answer to that would be yes. Are the patients both intrahepatic and extrahepatic? The answer is for sure yes. Here's a fantastic question. So, does it make sense? Are there plans to ever test with an ICI? So ICI stands for immune checkpoint inhibitor. So immune checkpoint inhibitors are a new type of treatment. Drugs that stimulate your immune system to help eliminate your tumor. So it's a very, very important set of drugs. So the answer to your question is for sure yes. We have some scientific information to suggest that 009 could be a very unique combination partner for immune checkpoint inhibitors. Stay tuned for that. We're actually working on that right now. Do you plan to open this medicine up to compassionate use for someone who doesn't qualify for the trial? So we've never done that before, but that's definitely something that we would consider. It's just we've never done that before here, but that's definitely something that we would consider. Assuming a positive trial, will you appeal to become part of standard of care? You bet we will. So, I think one of the things that we're excited about is, we're one of the first drugs that could be broadly used in patients with cholangiocarcinoma. So it's not mutation specific. So we would be very excited to do that. Yes. What happens if the study ends while a patient is still having a response stability? We've treated patients in some of our other studies for many years. If a patient is benefiting from the drug, I think they should be able to stay on the drug. In one of our other studies, one of the things that we've done for patients who are benefiting, if the study ends, we continue those patients on drug outside of the study. Somebody asks how many weeks of chemotherapy are required. There's no specific number. Similarly, someone asks a similar question, does durvalumab count as another line of therapy? So usually patients will get gemcitabine and cisplatin plus durvalumab. Then many patients will continue durvalumab as just by itself. So that would all count as one. That would count as one regimen. Gem-cis followed by durvalumab as part of one regimen. Same time that question came in, is Gem-cis durva patients eligible? The answer is yes. 009, more likely patients 4 or more rounds of chemotherapy. I don't know the answer to that. That's not something we've ever really tested. A patient with 4 rounds of chemotherapy. Okay. Does the study require any, or sorry, was there statistically any patients with particular biomarkers that had a better response? That's something we're working on right now to see if there might be biomarkers. So that's definitely something that we're working on. I don't have the answer to that yet. Are there patients in frontline treatments that might benefit? So that's a study that we're currently planning right now. Trying to get this drug tested in patients in the frontline setting. Did all patients in previous studies have extrahepatic disease? No. Did any go on to have resections after the study? I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I don't believe so. Does the study require any PPX medications due to cardiac toxicity? So the main toxicity that we've seen, besides the hypertension, so I assume that the question is about high blood pressure. So there are specific recommendations around high blood pressure medications to use. How late can patients enter the study? So I assume that question is a little bit about timing. So we're continuing to enroll patients now. Once we get to 150 patients, then the study would close, and then we would wait to see the results of the study. After the study gets to 150 patients, Then what we're probably going to do is we're going to probably start a first-line study after that, maybe sometime later this year. I'm sorry, but we do not have any clinical trial sites that are open in Canada. I'm sorry about that. Probably the closest U.S. site would be Roswell Park in upstate New York. Are patients who have received 4 or more rounds of chemotherapy eligible for the trials? I'm sorry, the answer to that is no.
I did have a couple of questions from someone who wrote in prior to the webinar. Okay. They're asking about, please clarify what is a definition of success in terms of the success rate?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. So there's a lot of complex statistical analyses that go into how these studies are analyzed. Success would be defined as a % of patients whose tumors get smaller. So that's the main study outcome that we're looking at in this study. Looking to see if in a larger, U.S.-based population, that we can see patients whose tumors get smaller.
And then how are the results and outcomes being monitored and managed?
Sure. So there are 2 big ways that it's being managed. So number 1, as I mentioned earlier, we have a steering committee, which is 5, very prominent physicians, including Dr. Borad, who are very experienced in treating patients with cholangiocarcinoma. And we meet with those physicians 4 times a year to review the study. Secondly, the study has something called a safety monitoring committee. And we meet with that committee, again, on a very frequent basis. We, in fact, met with them the week before last, and we presented the first set of safety data from the study, and the safety monitoring committee. This is a very formal process recommended to us based on their review of the safety information that the study should continue as designed. So that was a very good thing that happened a couple of weeks ago. If the results study are positive, will patients beyond 1 prior therapy be permitted? Ultimately, I think the answer to that is yes. The best way to get information about enrolling, you can certainly contact the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. You can contact us here at Compass. There are links in the clinicaltrials.gov posting to all of the sites that are open, and you'll find information that way. Is there financial assistance for those patients who have to travel to participate? The answer is yes, for sure. Has paclitaxel been used alone to treat cholangiocarcinoma before? It's not commonly been used before. There are some anecdotal reports in papers that have been published, but it has not commonly been used before. Okay. Are there characteristics of cholangiocarcinoma being hypervascular? I don't know the answer to that. Dr. Borad, do you want to comment on that? Hypervascular?
Yeah, there's been a subset of cancers on imaging that have been described as being hypervascular. Okay. I would estimate it to be around 10 to 15%.
Okay, great. Did patients on study in phase 1/2, what's relation to neuropathy? We did not see a neuropathy with this drug. As I'm sure you know, many of you know, neuropathy is a common side effect of cisplatin, and also sometimes patients treated with Taxol get neuropathy. And there are some dose reductions to the chemotherapy if need be.
It looks like you answered all of the questions that have come through. If anyone has any other questions, please enter them into the chat or the Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and will be on the YouTube page, so if you want to reference back to it, you absolutely can.
Is CTX-009 oral or IV? It's IV. So it's given by an IV infusion every 2 weeks. Is hair lost with paclitaxel? Sometimes, yes.
It looks like those are the last of the questions.
Well,
Thank you so much.
I can't tell you how wonderful it is to talk to you all. I really appreciate all of these questions, which are super good questions, and it's just a really a tremendous privilege for me to talk to you all about this, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this.
Thank you both so much for sharing about this and answering all of the questions that came through. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who joined in on the webinar today.
Thank you so much, Lords. Thank you, Dr. Borad.
Okay. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.